In this next edition of Bij de Hond in de Pot, I have an interview with Julius Ruechel. I hope I pronounce it well.
Yeah.
Okay. You are from Canada, and maybe you can introduce yourself to the audience.
Sure. Yeah. Well, like I said, I'm actually got into this whole coronavirus thing because I noticed that there was a massive gap in investigative reporting. But before coronavirus started, I was running my a website educating cattle farmers on pasture-focused production and trading the commodity market. So in that sense, I was doing some of the data analysis on the trading the market. So as I'm familiar with playing with numbers, and then from the cattle farming end of it, that I was used to digging into agricultural research reports on everything from that you do kind of get into a lot of the physiology and stuff like that, and translating that into practical strategies for farming. So I was fairly comfortable to dive into this stuff, even though I don't have a background in virology or anything like that. But yeah, it was just start reading endlessly in the medical journals and digging into the data. So that's how I fell into this. And
What was the first aspect what you thought this is different, or this is not like everybody says? I was with aerosols, and you?
Yeah, actually, it's funny because I started following this in I think it was either late December or beginning of January, or late December 2019 or beginning of January 2020. And um, the original data coming out of China was so scary that I was fairly convinced that this was going to be a really big deal. And then there was the issue happening on the Diamond Princess cruise ship where only 20% of the people were infected, even though it was obviously rolling through the ventilation shafts. And then the other part of it was that I noticed that some of these attacks on some of the scientists, like Dr. John Ioannidis, that they were completely unhinged. There was no discussion of data. They just basically were character attacking him. And so at that point, I started to go, well, maybe there's something more than what the data presents. So I dug into what he was looking at, and I noticed that our government was suddenly freaking out and saying that like when the border closures, that discussion was happening, and the Chinese community here in Canada said, listen, there's a whole bunch of other Chinese that are going to China for the Chinese New Year's. And so maybe they should quarantine when they get back so that we don't bring that virus here. And the government ignored the fact that this concern was coming from the Chinese community and claimed that this was a racist thing to be saying this. And it's like, okay, so the government is not taking this seriously at all and is using this for some other political purpose. And so at that point, like any trust that I had in the government's ability to handle this was gone. And so I knew I needed to dig into the data. So those are kind of the steps that dragged me into this. And so, yeah, the first piece that I put out was in April. Like I basically woke up in March, and by April of 2020, I put out the first piece saying, listen, like, here's what the data says. And at that point, I hadn't recognized that it was, this mass hysteria and that there was all these opportunists diving into it as well. I just said, listen, I just felt like, okay, there's a panic and people are making mistakes, so there's a problem. And then it rolled from there into bigger and bigger things.
It looks like my history.
Yeah.
So how many articles you published about Corona?
I'm not sure how many it works out to now, but I've been doing these deep dives where I'm trying to really take that 60,000 foot view perspective of trying to understand the big picture. So there's been one, I think in the early period it wasn't very many, and then probably for the last year and a bit it's been almost one a month, or sometimes even a little bit more than that. And then I've done a lot of different interviews and whatnot. So I'm each time trying to tackle one portion to kind of give the public a chance to understand what's going on, because on the one hand you have the scientists that are talking in vocabulary that is often inaccessible to somebody that's outside of the industry, and then you have these bits of data that are completely out of context. Like when you hear that so many people have died of coronavirus, well, is that a lot or is that a little number? Like how does that compare to the number of people that have actually passed away from influenza in previous years in different age categories and things like that? So that perspective is what I'm always looking for.
And I read some of your articles. They are very large, long reads.
Yeah.
People say for me also that I make the articles a little bit too long, but yours, how many words are there? The last one where we will discuss now a little bit about, but How many words were it in total?
I'm not sure how many words it was, but it's funny because I keep getting the criticisms that the long ones are too long, and yet the long ones are by far the most popular articles. And because if you take a short article, you can only really capture one slice, but it's only when you put all those slices together that a bigger picture really pops out. And so they've been the longest ones have been the most popular, so it's okay, I guess.
And how many readers do you think you have per article on average?
It varies, but I think my most popular article is over 250,000. So
respect.
Yeah.
I don't write in English, or I try to translate some of my articles in English, but still, for the Netherlands, we sometimes have 100, 200,000 readers for an article.
Oh wow, that's fantastic.
Yeah, mainly I want to talk about your last article, the one who we translated in Dutch also, because in a way this is also even more out of your league, no? Because that was not mainly data analysis or a little bit of data analysis.
Yeah, it was actually, I basically wanted to grapple with this idea of why the flu disappeared. Because it's funny how like the media has used this as evidence of the masks work and the social distancing work, that's why the flu disappeared. But that's patently obviously wrong. Like, I mean, I showed in that piece the graph from Canada where the flu disappeared very clearly based on the actual flu testing results that the government does on the 30th of March. And it wasn't until 2 months later that the government switched from don't wear masks to wear masks as a recommendation. And then another 2 months after that before there was the first mask mandate. So you can see that something else is going on there. And figuring that out is actually one of the most important clues as to understand what the trajectory of this virus is going to be in the future. So unraveling this mystery about why is it gone and why is it coming back in many countries. I mean, there's many countries that have all these mask mandates, and now the flu is back anyways. So the government's message is broken once again, But so the understanding why it's coming back kind of gives us an idea of what this, like the lifespan of this pandemic actually is, and what controls when it ends.
Yeah, I also wrote an article already in 2020 or 2020 about that flu disappeared, and that it was not because of what we did against COVID that also flu disappeared, but it was, they called, Hope Simpson called it the Vanishing Act.
Yeah.
Something what also happened with the influenza in 2009.
Yes.
And also in 1 month it disappeared completely. And apparently there was the rhinovirus or another virus who replaced it.
Yeah, I think the cold virus is actually cut short that the influenza virus. That once the cold season started, it essentially displaced or choked out this other pandemic that never really got going.
Yes, you always have a kind of flavor of the year, I call it in a way. But maybe you can tell the audience about your main findings, and then we will, more in the conversation, talk about those findings.
Yeah, so what I was really interesting is that this idea of viral interference, it was discovered, I think, for the first time in 1929 in plants, where an infection with one virus can block an infection with another virus. And so, I mean, it happens on any scale, like even I think that's one of the reasons why you don't get 4 different strains of influenza in the winter, that whichever is the dominant strain suppresses the other strains. And it also happens between different viruses where, as we talked about a minute ago, like that the cold virus can actually suppress the influenza virus when that next season starts. So it's happening even on a small scale. It's what creates virus seasonality. But when you get a big event like this, where there's a relatively new virus that, it may be closely related to other coronaviruses, but it's something that our immune systems haven't really seen before, that effect of viral interference seems to be so strong that it's able to push everything else out the door for a very long period until the rest of the population has some degree of natural immunity to where it no longer produces such a strong immune response. And I mean, we've seen this, that the influenza virus disappeared people have talked about hardly getting any colds. The RSV virus disappeared. Like basically the entire smorgasbord of viruses is gone. And I, at first, like there's been a lot of folks talking about, well, the PCR test is just misidentifying the flu virus. But the thing is that the flu testing programs continued, and we have the data showing every single flu test. Like there's, I don't know how many millions of these things that have happened around the world, but they've all come back negative. So if the testing didn't, like there's no change that suddenly happened to the test kits that are being rolled out for flu. So that there we have the direct evidence that the flu is not being misidentified. It's actually gone.
I saw already in some countries where the COVID was very low, that their influenza came up again.
Yes.
Like in Nepal and some other countries. But my question then is, if I see those countries, it is not the end of COVID because somewhere it comes back also.
Yes.
How do you describe that mechanism?
Okay, so what I dug into the antibody testing in different countries, right? So like India, Brazil, South Africa, these are all countries that the virus, like COVID, spread so quickly that the antibody testing shows that the majority of the population now has a certain degree of natural immunity to this thing, right? So as soon as you reach that high level of natural immunity, you suddenly see the flu come back. And it's like until it reaches that high point, it's gone. And then the moment you have that, like South Africa is over 80% natural immunity now, and boom, the virus comes, the influenza virus is able to come back. But the idea of natural immunity, like from digging into all of these respiratory viruses, these viruses change so fast, and the immune response actually fades fairly quickly. So natural immunity does not mean that you'll never get re-exposed to this virus. It just means that when you are exposed, you have enough partial immunity left over from the last time that you're probably not going to end up in hospital and you're not going to die. You're just going to get out. You might have mild symptoms. You might get a flu or a cold and a runny nose, but that's it. Like it's going to now behave like every other seasonal virus that is part of like there's over 200 viruses that are part of respiratory virus season. Like, there's para-influenza viruses and influenza and rhinovirus and adenoviruses, and like and we're able to re-catch those same viruses year after year after year, but they don't produce a very strong, unless you have a weak immune system, you're not going to get sick and die. You're not going to end up in hospital. You're just going to have a runny nose, right? So that's where you can see that transition happen in a virus behavior where it becomes endemic, is that it's now behaving much like those other viruses. And I mean, coronaviruses are known, like they produce 15 to 30% of all colds every year. And in many cases, you can catch a new coronavirus infection basically the day after you've healed from the previous one. So there's not very long-lasting complete protection, but there's enough protection to prevent you from getting really sick. And so that's, I think, what was interesting about South Africa, is that Omicron came in after everybody had 80% natural immunity to this thing. And they had a huge wave of infections, but hardly anybody died. And it basically is demonstrating that now this coronavirus is essentially just joining the other coronaviruses and can coexist with these other flu viruses. And it's, the pandemic is done. We're now in the endemic stage.
Only a lot of CDCs are not yet to acknowledge this.
No, that's right.
Well, because what surprised me, if you talk about what happened with influenza, that you came to that conclusion based on what you read. I came to the same conclusion because based on what I read. That was also in a kind of data analysis and logic. Yeah, if influenza is gone, it must have a connection with what happens with COVID.
Yeah.
And because it started first in the southern hemisphere in 2020, the influenza, first it left in Western Europe, but that was the end of the season. Maybe that was the reason. But then it happened in the southern hemisphere, and I was really flabbergasted, because when October, November started in 2020, then the Dutch CDC said everybody has to have his influenza vaccination, because we also will get a huge influenza season.
Yeah.
And I said to everybody, also on my article, I am not sure why don't you wait until influenza starts, because I think it will not happen.
Yeah.
And what I'm very surprised is that what you found out and what I found out and some other people found out, Eva Cummins also, and then and that's completely apparently new for virologists and epidemiologists. So
yeah, I mean, we've had a couple of different, like for example, in British Columbia, the chief health officer there has actually talked about that this thing is now entering the endemic stage, that we're going to have to live with it. And there's been, I think I quoted a couple other people, I think in one of the last pieces that I've put out, that are like, some of the CDCs are starting to acknowledge it, even though they're not changing any of their policies and strategies yet. It's really bizarre.
but they're not connected to influenza, because there they don't see that influenza is gone because of the coronavirus, but because of the good things they did because of masks and other kinds of things to stop spreading. While they were not successful in stopping COVID, they were successful in stopping influenza.
Yeah, I'm certain they know. I mean, this is not rocket science. They all knew beforehand that masks don't work. There's been endless, randomized controlled trials, the gold standard of science, demonstrating this. And yet somehow, I think the public messaging, and I mean, we see it. Anybody that tries to speak out against this stuff, that if they're part of that system, immediately has a million other people jumping on them and demonizing them, and their jobs are at risk. So nobody dares say anything. But it's phenomenal.
Just all over the world, and almost any country. What you did also in your article was writing about several different countries, because not each country didn't have the same approach.
That's right.
And in the beginning, nobody knew what was the right approach. We know very well how Sweden was condemned by doing it differently than the rest. But now, after almost 2 years, we can see the consequences. Can you describe what you found out in several countries and why you think those countries are now in the current situation, and what you expect, because you had some harsh forecasts for some of the countries?
Well, I think that the Sweden example is a good one to start with, because Sweden and Germany have essentially the same vaccination rate, right? The main difference between them is that Sweden has high natural immunity. The antibody tests show that, and it's because they didn't have all these lockdowns. Whereas Germany has very low natural immunity because of their lockdowns. But the actual the actual variants that have been in each of those countries have been exactly the same. And so we saw, for example, during this last, like in November, the Delta variant was taking off like crazy. And Germany started having a large number of deaths again. But Sweden had the exact same wave. It also had infections, but there was hardly any deaths. So the difference was natural immunity. It was not vaccination. Like, the vaccine cannot take the credit there. It's impossible, right? So what we see is also Germany has no influenza yet. The flu tests are still coming back negative. Sweden, which has high natural immunity, the flu is back. So you keep seeing this, like that the only thing that can actually make the pandemic less dangerous is natural immunity. It is not the vaccines. The vaccines are unable to do that. And we also saw that in a country like India and in Brazil. We've now seen that the mortality rates have essentially stopped, and yet they stopped before the vaccine rollout. It reached, like, I think in Brazil, it was around 20% or something like that. And in India, it was even lower than that, before the vaccine rollout had hardly reached anybody, and the pandemic was already gone, and the flu was already coming back. So they're now still pushing vaccines for a population that has no measurable difference in risk to this virus versus any other flu virus in the wintertime. It's insane, right? Like, it's really wasting everybody's time, and potentially harming a lot of people through adverse reactions to a vaccine if there's no more benefit to this. It's crazy.
And Netherlands is roughly like Germany. Not exactly the same, but roughly like Germany. I had some also a kind of theory about natural immunity, and also about every time when there is really exponential growth, almost very soon you have exponential decrease. And I had also a kind of theory about it. I said, you have apparently the viral dose is the moment if you get enough of the viral dose, then you become infected. Yeah.
Right.
And of course, if you are older, then less viral dose could be already a reason to become affected. But also, of course, if there is a viral dose, a lot of people are getting less than the viral dose. So, in my opinion, the natural immunity is not like you should be infected and then you have natural immunity, but also if you get 3 times half of the viral dose, it's also teaching your immune system some lessons.
Well, this has been one of the big, enlightening moments of when I was digging through this, is that, like you go by PCR test and it shows you, I can't remember what it was in different countries. Like there's, several 100,000 people that have been already tested positive. And yet the antibody tests show you that, like in a country like, I think it was in South Africa, there was something like 200,000 people that have been, I can't remember the exact number, something like 200,000 people that have been, positive cases, and yet 80% of the population is showing antibodies to this thing, which means that there's like 5% of all the exposures actually show up as a PCR positive test. Everyone else, the immune system sees this thing, builds antibodies to it, and the person never even knew that they were at all sick. These are completely asymptomatic exposures. Like I don't even want to call them an infection, because it's such a minor exposure to this thing that is building immunity. And I mean, this is where what you were just talking about these CDCs warning about a really bad flu season, that your immune system requires frequent exposure to these other viruses in order to maintain the memory to be able to mount a very fast response. So if you don't have that exposure, you lose that memory. So that suggests that most of us are constantly being re-exposed to these viruses, but we're not getting 200 colds and flus every year. Most of those exposures are an asymptomatic immune memory boost. That's about it.
But again, the definition, what is infected or not, is even a very gray area.
Very much so.
Somebody told me, you have to compare it like if it's summer starts and the first day you are in the sun, you can only be in the sun for, let's say, 10 minutes, and then your skin is so red that you have to be getting out of the sun. And the next day, or the 3 days later, you can do 20 minutes or 30 minutes. And apparently also, if there's a lot of people get really infected and a little bit ill or even more ill, I think 5 times more, not only are the people who are getting infected without symptoms, but are people who are not getting infected, but still got already a first training. Yeah. And most probably, again, that's my assumption, that if you get the first training, then your level of viral dose you need to be becoming really ill is increasing.
That's a really good point, yeah.
So it's a very variable way of doing it. And that can explain also why after the rapid increase, you get also the rapid decrease, because so many people were in contact with the virus without even becoming infected.
Exactly. Yeah, I mean, the deer population in Iowa, apparently 80% of the deer now have some kind of, like they tested positive on a PCR test to coronavirus. Like it shows you how many in a population have some kind of exposure very rapidly, even though the woods are not filled with coughing and dying deer in Iowa. So it's, yeah.
So they should wear masks now at the deer in Iowa.
Something like that.
Okay.
But I mean, this idea that your immune system, your immunity fades. Like New Zealand is an interesting case where, I mean, they basically kept the coronavirus out, but because they disrupted all the normal traffic of, I mean, there's like 11 million people, normally visiting New Zealand every year in a population of 5 million. So, this mixing of people is part of the global, seasonal virus transmission cycle. So by closing the borders, they kept everything else out. And as a result, they had nothing for a long time. And so what's really interesting is the RSV virus in 2020, it would basically flatline. Like you can see again, all the tests that were done, and there were just hardly any testing positive. And then partway through 2021, there was an outbreak. And because of that long immunity debt of not being exposed, it produced a massive spike. Like I show on the, in one of the graphs in my article, this huge spike that comes from their CDC or whoever it is that published that. It's unreal how vulnerable, just even a year without regular exposure, like how vulnerable everyone became in that short time period. So that tells me that our CDCs know very well when they're saying that there's going to be a bad flu season coming, that what happened during COVID has made everyone more vulnerable to these other viruses. So
you think that New Zealand will get a very severe influenza season?
Well, once they open their borders after all of this time of not having anything, there's going to be large numbers of all sorts of spikes, particularly in the vulnerable populations, like in the nursing homes. And so if they're still using PCR tests and making a big panic, they're going to keep scaring their population every time they try to open the border. The only way is to stop PCR testing and explain that the only way to move forward is to protect the vulnerable while everyone else gets a cold. So the public messaging has to come back to reality. Otherwise, they can keep scaring themselves to death for forever if they want to, and they'll never be able to reopen.
Yeah, but sometimes I have the feeling that some politicians like the way that they have much more control over their population than they had in a normal situation.
Yeah, very much so. Very much so.
And some of the other countries, maybe you...
Yeah, I mean, Canada was an interesting test case because, similar to Germany, we had very, very low natural immunity when Omicron arrived. But in November, Germany was still dealing with Delta, whereas Omicron basically started in Canada. That we didn't have a Delta wave before Omicron started. And so Omicron basically displaced Delta, just like that, in the same idea of this viral displacement. And what we're seeing is massive numbers of infections, cases, but very, very low death numbers. Like these are orders of magnitude more people that are being exposed to this. And the ICU numbers and the hospital numbers are not dramatically different from previous waves. So it really proves that even a population with low natural immunity is not particularly vulnerable to Omicron. Omicron is a mild variant no matter who you are,
Okay. And it doesn't make a difference if you are vaccinated, infected before or not, or unvaccinated, or
this is
different exposure?
This is where it gets interesting, right? Because, for example, I've been looking at the data from Quebec, and apples to apples comparison, cases per 100,000 people, there is no difference whatsoever between the vaccinated and the unvaccinated. The vaccinated are catching this thing just as much as the unvaccinated. Now, there is still a slightly higher numbers of people that are unvaccinated that are ending up in ICU and in hospital. But it's not very clear as to what's actually going on there without knowing some of the details on the demographics. But the other thing is that anybody that's had a vaccination doesn't actually count as vaccinated until at least 2 weeks after they've been vaccinated. And yet there was a piece published by the Ontario CDC. Professor Didier Raoul from France mentioned it in his last piece. And it shows very clearly that the number of breakthrough infections is orders of magnitude higher in that 2-week period. So how many of these unvaccinated people are actually people that have been vaccinated but haven't been in that, that are in that 2-week transition period? To actually have a meaningful idea of what's going on with the data, you actually need 3 categories: totally unvaccinated, within that vulnerable 2-week period, and after the 2-week peried. So
what could be the reason, by the way? Do you think that especially in those 2 weeks you are more vulnerable?
Well, looking into a lot of the different vaccine injuries, I'm going to speculate without knowing. I mean, I don't know for sure, but it seems like there is a temporary immune suppression that's caused by that vaccine. And so you actually have a weaker immune response that if you do get an exposure, instead of ending up with an asymptomatic antibody response, you end up with a full-blown disease. I mean, a lot of the vaccine injuries show that, and the coronavirus itself, it actually causes an autoimmune response. So the spike protein, it's not inconceivable that that's doing the same thing in that 2-week window.
And you also wrote about Kenya, and Kenya is not really a focus of a lot of people in the West. So maybe you can explain what was so interesting in Kenya.
Kenya is one of the few exceptions around the world where the flu didn't disappear, which is really different from all the other countries. And I mean, COVID also swept through Kenya, but they had such the numbers of deaths and hospitalizations and all that are orders of magnitude lower than in the rest of the world. I mean, I think it's like Canada is 10 times more, had 10 times more, deaths with COVID, with or from COVID, than what Kenya had. And so they just never had the strong response. And that's, to me, a very clear sign. And I mean, the variants that swept through Kenya are exactly the same as Canada. So the same variant that produced a higher number of deaths in Canada produced a lower number of deaths in Kenya. So the only difference there has to be, actual factors in the population. There's things like demographics where, they have certainly a younger population, but they also have, like, there's over 2.6 million people living in Kenya with HIV, which is a major risk factor for a bad outcome with COVID. So they should have been absolutely flattened by COVID, and they weren't. So that suggests that there's a lot of other things like, vitamin D deficiencies in the northern hemisphere that don't happen there, and more social support and less isolation. All these things that are risk factors for having a bad outcome. That just and maybe it's also like going outside more and so you can. It suggests that you can manage how deadly this respiratory virus is by focusing on preventative measures and protective lifestyle choices in the vulnerable demographic to protect them, rather than seeing the vaccine as the only way out.
And you also wrote that malaria is a huge problem in Kenya if you even compare it to COVID in our countries.
Yeah, I mean, the malaria, it was a great example of just how little perspective is being given by our, public health agencies. Like, they've just completely lost the plot here that, in Kenya, there's been, I think, 3,000 or 5,000 COVID deaths in a 2-year period. And in the same period, there would have been 20,000 malaria deaths. I think the World Bank put out a statement that said that in the same period that in Africa that there was 30,000 COVID deaths, there was over 410,000 malaria deaths. And yet nobody, locks up people that have malaria. Nobody denies them their individual autonomy and all of these things. And yet,
and the demographics of those people is much younger, of course, I think, than COVID. That's
another really good point, because I mean the malaria is mostly taking the very young children, whereas COVID is overwhelmingly taking people that are 65 plus. Most of them are 80 plus that have severe other underlying conditions or are already dying of cancer and leukemia and all these other things. So I mean, in terms of years of lives lost, like it's malaria is a colossal drain on Africa, whereas COVID hardly affects the overall dying. So to put that into perspective and actually understand that maybe you can protect the vulnerable without destroying all these lives with these different lockdowns. And that's the other part of the lack of perspective. I think it was World Bank or the World Food Program said that there's over 250 children in Africa that are now out of school for basically 2 years without online learning opportunities because of COVID. And there's over 50 million in Africa that have had that are now reduced to like 1 or 2 meals a day because they're not getting their school meals anymore. I mean, this is like you're literally throwing your children under the bus to protect folks that actually could be protected on their own without having to damage the rest of society.
There's also, of course, a discussion: will there come new mutations? And will they be more severe than Omicron? What is your take on that?
Well, I mean, once you get a certain amount of natural immunity, even the slightly more dangerous mutations are likely not going to be, they aren't going to be the Spanish flu. They, just like influenza has bad years and not so bad years, that's the normal thing. And I mean, the mutations continue never endingly, like that they never stop. And I mean, we are passing this thing back and forth between all sorts of other animals and ourselves. I mean, mink, deer, like all of these different species also catch corona. So there's no way that you could ever stop fresh variants from coming, and which is how many of the other flu viruses and cold viruses that we get also behave. We can pass them back, many of them back and forth between us. That's why there's new variants that come along. So that's sort of the natural endemic behavior of a virus that you share with other species.
But if we compare, let's say, the coming years, then normally every year we have an influenza year, and maybe in the near future we have 1 year an influenza year, another year a COVID year or so. Is that what happens, or do you think it will be different than this?
Well, my suspicion is that, like, looking at the seasonality of all of these different viruses, the COVID has actually, when you look at these big waves that come through, they line up with the waves of the other 4 coronaviruses that cause colds and flus. So my suspicion would be that it's going to compete with those other 4 coronavirus as to which one of those ones gets to make the seasonal coronavirus wave that year. And then once that, colds tend to happen before influenza season starts, and then as influenza season peaks, then coronavirus season starts. So that's, if you have a calendar, every virus gets a little slot, and that's about it. So I think that that's more likely how this is going to behave. But yeah,
the difference will be that we need to get the hysteria out of corona, because with influenza we never had this hysteria. And if in the future they really only check on corona and start the hysteria again, then we will go in from lockdown to lockdown in the future.
Well, I think this is one of the really dishonest things that the public health agencies have done, is that, in the past, a case was defined as someone that was symptomatic, right? And so then you can publish case fatality rates based on how many people that are, actually coming down with it are ending up in hospital and ending up dying. Whereas what they started doing is doing mass PCR testing of the entire population. And so they don't catch all PCR or all infections, but they catch a large number of the asymptomatics. So it gives the impression that this thing is much more common than other viruses. But if we had the exact same standards for influenza or rhinovirus, where every single person that, if you were mass testing for these viruses in the population, you would also see much higher case numbers. And if you started mixing people that are, in palliative care that are dying of another disease, and then they have a positive PCR test for influenza or rhinovirus, we would be able to scare the entire society silly every single winter with how many flu deaths or how many cold deaths there are, when in reality, that's not the case. So they're using a completely different standard of reporting here with COVID than with any of these other viruses. If we did the same thing, COVID would not really stick out as a different virus than any of the others.
No, I did research in 2018 when we were at a very tough influenza season, with about 10,000 people died because of influenza. And I did, via my opinion poll in March or in April, I asked people if they had influenza in the months before. And I calculated that about 5.5 million of the people in the Netherlands, we have about 17 million, had influenza. And based on that, I made the calculations by hospitalization and also by mortality, and compared it with Delta, and then compared it with the Omicron. And if you compare it with Delta, you could say roughly Delta and influenza in that year was the same in hospitalizations and also mortality. But then, because you can compare Omicron with Delta, I could also compare Omicron with influenza.
Yeah.
And then I saw that, the hospitalization was maybe 1/5 or even less than the influenza, and mortality is about 1/10 of influenza. In the Netherlands, influenza in that year had a mortality of, I believe, around 0.17% those 5.5 million.
Yeah.
And I think Omicron will have about 0.03% of the cases.
Yeah.
And then again, with or because of is still the discussion.
Yeah.
So, yeah, we're completely out of the woods.
Yeah.
Only there are still a lot of people who really think we are in the middle of the woods, I assume.
Well, it was interesting seeing Sweden's all-cause mortality data year by year, right? Because they're the sort of the control group where lockdowns and masks and all that weren't all mandatory, right? So, 2019, prior to COVID, was the lowest year on record for all-cause mortality. 2020 came along and it basically bumped it back to 2012 levels. And I mean, they've already admitted that they did a very lousy job protecting the nursing homes, because I mean, there's a 6 to 8 week wave that rolls through, and you should be really careful about not letting a virus into a nursing home. But after that, everything should be fine. So they screwed that up, and they still ended up only with a slight bump. And 2021 is shaping up to be the second lowest rate on record, right after 2019. So despite the fact that they're in the middle of a world-changing pandemic, it's the second lowest death rate in their history. Like, this is
and in almost all the other European countries, you have a higher mortality than in 2020.
Yeah.
And that's also a funny story, because the word funny is maybe not the right word. That because on the one hand, our health officials say that our vaccination really helps against severe illness and so on, and then the additional mortality, they say that's because of COVID. And then I say, if it really helps you against severe illness, it also should help against mortality. But logical combinations is not always there. I don't know if they don't know it or how to do it, or they want to do it in that way.
Well, I mean, I noticed that, like, for example, I think it was The Economist put out a piece that there's something like 20 million excess deaths around the world. But based on like COVID death certificates, and that already includes with and from COVID, there's only like around 5.5 million. So they're trying to claim that COVID caused those extra 15 million deaths. And yet there's no way that you can pull that out from the data to say, well, is this death caused by lockdown and on the economic dislocation, like in Africa and places like that? How many of these excess deaths are now caused by adverse events from the vaccines? Like, there's no way to pull that out. This is what I find interesting about Sweden, is that that's where you actually can, remove the one factor, which is the effect of lockdowns, and just see what was actually happening as a result of the virus itself. And
now, I also had a theory about that mortality, what also in the Netherlands is high.
Yeah.
And everybody wants to claim his own success, either because of COVID or because of vaccination or whatever. And I really have the impression, but I don't know if that's maybe your opinion too, that there was a kind of stability in the society where everything what happened in the society was a normal process. Yeah. And because in the way we completely changed our way of living, start to be very scared, our social contexts were different, that a part of the additional mortality is because of that stability in the society disappeared. And this is a part of a new stability if you live that way, in a complete different way than the years before. And it has nothing to do in COVID because of COVID, and it has also nothing to do, I mean, a part of it, of course, COVID, a part of it, vaccination adverse, but I think a majority is because we completely start to live in a different way.
Yeah, I was in contact with a healthcare worker here in Canada, and she works in basically these palliative care homes, right? And so she was talking about, or in these long-term care homes, and she was talking about how like there's actually only a small number of their patients that receive regular visitors. A lot of people don't, which is like it's actually pretty sad that our society cares so little about its old folks. But she went through the data in there, like their official numbers in their old folks home, And the portion of people that normally would get the most number of regular social contacts, that were like their families are always coming in to visit them, the moment COVID stopped and they were no longer able to get their families, that's the group that had by far the highest number of COVID deaths. Because, and I mean, we know this, that, you know, depression and isolation, all are immune dampening responses. It's not like our immune system is just this, you know, stable system. Like, there's all sorts of things that can bring it down, and one of that is destroying social contacts. So,
and then, you know, then for, especially for those old folks, then maybe their feeling is, why should I continue to live if there's nothing to live for?
That's right. So it actually depresses their immune systems. Like, this is, you know, this was established science prior to 2020, that, you know, isolation has even an immune response to it. So it's unreal.
Thank you very much. It's very interesting, and I really. What is your next project?
I've got a few different pieces on the go. I just published a different one that was called "Who Do We Trust If We Can't Trust the Science?" And it was, again, I was talking about, like, how do we know that the flu virus was not the COVID virus? But I was using that as a backdrop to actually address, like, how should the public approach this when you can't actually trust the faces talking on TV, and sort of trying to remind our institutions of how science is meant to work, and that it's not a process of just, you know, waving credentials in people's faces, that it really is an evidence-based thing, and that you need that constant debate and evidence and counter evidence so that the truth can bubble to the surface, even if every single person that's part of that debate is wrong on some level or is a flawed individual. Like, it's that science is that it's the combination, or the conversation that happens between people, as opposed to just a matter of, you know, technically measuring something. That debate process is how you start finding the weaknesses and the errors and the mistakes that have been made in the scientific process, and that we really have to hold our institutions accountable to that again in order for science to work.
Do you have any platform in traditional media, or are people interviewing you, a journalist or television or radio? Or is it only your own website?
No, I've had lots of you know, what's alternative media, that sort of the parallel media system that's starting to grow out of this. The traditional media has not been willing to take any of our stuff, but I am noticing that the traditional media is starting to ask more difficult questions now. So they're starting to, I think a certain amount of these messages are starting to bleed into their consciousness. And I mean, the fact that places like Joe Rogan's show in the United States is picking this up, like, it's huge. The public's mind is changing. It's now just a question of how long will the government hang on for dear life because their reputations are at stake, you know?
I really like to publish your next pieces also in Dutch. Yeah, and we keep in touch. Thank you very much for this interview.
Thank you so much.
I wish you a lot of success with your endeavors.
Likewise. Let's stay in touch. That was fun.
Yeah. Okay.